This is Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom Today. Thank you so much for joining. This episode, I'm doing something different. I have a very special guest, Shoaib Hussain, with me. Those who listen to this podcast might not be aware that I'm also a tech entrepreneur. I'm the CEO and founder of a platform, a fundraising platform, a securities issuance platform called Invone.com. I never plug it on this platform, but here we go. Invone.com. You can look it up. And over the last number of months, nearly a year now, we've had a very complex migration going on from one cloud to the other, from AWS to GCP. Now, those who listen to this podcast probably don't know what I'm talking about, but just be aware that it actually takes a lot of time and effort to figure out if you built a piece of custom software and you've built it on one cloud provider, in our case, Amazon Web Services, and then you want to move it and migrate it to another cloud provider, in this case, Google, it actually takes quite a bit of expertise and time and effort to do it right and to make sure that you don't have any downtime and that you don't end up impacting the customer. And that was very important to us. So I hired Shoaib to do that, and Shoaib did a fantastic job. He and his team migrated, and migration is now finished. And if anyone goes to invone.com, you will find that it's all working on GCP, and our customers knew not the difference of the transition. So I'm very grateful to you, Shoaib, for helping me out with that. It was a long process, and we got it done. So thank you. Now, the other thing is that and I have quite a bit in common as well, in the sense that we're both from London, a number of years apart. You're considerably younger than I am, I believe. But from London, we both went to University College London, both went to UCL, so we went to the same university. So we're alumnus of University College London, and we both work in tech. You as director of Interstellar, I as CEO of Invone. And we also, though, we come from different backgrounds. I'm Jewish, hence Jewish wisdom. And Shoaib, you're Muslim. And I know you don't like to say you're a very religious Muslim because of your humility around it. But I believe that you are a very religious and devout Muslim. And we've had lots of different conversations along the time that we've worked together from December 2023 up till this date. So I just want to let the audience know what we're not going to talk about today. We are not going to discuss the conflict in the Middle East. Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't had multiple conversations about that. And we've agreed and disagreed on some things we agree on, some things we disagree on. We've had very civil, respectful conversations about it, but there's plenty of podcasts if you want to listen to people debating it and getting all hot under the collar and upset about it. Yes, please go to other podcasts, listen to that. You're not going to hear it here because that's not going to be the topic of conversation today. But we are going to talk about Islam, and we're going to talk about Judaism, and we're going to have a conversation of two people who come from sister religions and have that kind of conversation. So firstly, after that preamble, I want to thank you very much for agreeing to be on Truths, Jewish Wisdom for the Day podcast. We'll see how the audience takes to this conversation. I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since a few months after we started working together. And you said that you didn't want to do it until you'd finished your obligations to me properly. And I really respected that. Once you finished your obligations to me, because we had a contract, then you were going to come on the podcast. You finished your obligations. You did what you said you were going to do in an exemplary manner. I'm really grateful to that. And I'll give you a quick plug. If anyone needs this kind of service, please reach out to Shoaib. But here we are now. We're doing the podcast. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure, Levi, to be on the show. And I'm also looking forward to it because I know that you're very knowledgeable about religion, much more than I am. So I think this is going to be very interesting.
Well, certainly a lot less knowledgeable about Islam than you are. Let's start off. Give me a little bit of a background. I'm going to imagine that most of my listeners, people who listen to this podcast, either know nothing about Islam, or what they do know might come from certain types of areas that either is misinformation or is not relevant to the majority of Muslims, etc. So what I would like to do is, if you could orient us where you are, what's your background, what's your tradition, what's your school of thought in Islam, and so tell us where you are, and then how that relates to all these other schools of thoughts, etc. Like, orient us as if we're total ignoramuses, which we are in this. Orient us where you are.
And how would you like a short answer? Would you like a long answer? I want to kind of tailor my answer to what, to what.
Give us as much
kind of.
an answer which is as informative as possible without losing the audience.
Okay, so let's first of all start with what my definition of Islam is before we
Okay.
even get into Islam, because I actually did have some moments of where I felt like Islam was quite strict because we have 5 daily prayers, we have fasting, we have charity. Fasting and charity, I didn't find to be that strict, to be honest. I actually enjoyed fasting, and now when I give the charity, I'm starting to enjoy and actually like that as well. But with
Now that
prayer,
you're
I
making
found
money.
uh, well, I'm not there yet, but yeah, still. It's about kind of letting go of that desire for having more and more, right? So,
Mhm.
actually, and when you give to somebody, even if it's £2, and you see somebody smile, you're just like, oh, this feels really good, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what is Islam, right? And often we hear so many different definitions. So somebody will say Islam means quote unquote peace. Then you will hear somebody who says Islam means quote unquote submission. You will find other things as well. But for me, it was a long journey to actually understand what Islam meant, at least for me. And for me, the definition I came up with was from kind of the Sufi tradition, which we can get to in some time. And it would be actually that you submit, I think, is too low of a word. It's not, it doesn't capture the intensity of actually desire for being encapsulated by the will of God. So really the idea is you're completely encapsulated by the will of God. And through that encapsulation and that love for God, right? This real and intense form of desire to be close to God, you attain peace. And the idea is that love of God means love of humanity and working for the best of your ability to serve humanity. So that would first of all be your family unit, and then secondarily society. So I think that would be my definition of Islam. And then the kind of obligations that we have, sort of prayer and fasting and the charity or the purification through charity, and the Hajj are means through which you attain higher levels of purification of the self and closeness to God in order to pursue the aim of serving God and humanity, your family, and society as a whole.
And just remind us what the Hajj is for
So,
those
so
who
the
don't know.
Hajj the Hajj is essentially a pilgrimage which occurs once a year in Mecca. And here, essentially, the theology has a lot to do with Abraham, where I think one of Abraham's wives was left near Mecca. I think it was. Okay, so I may not
Was
be
that
completely
Hagar?
right. I think so, Hajra, maybe. Yeah, I think so. And her son essentially started crying because they were in the middle of the desert.
That's
And
Ishmael.
yeah, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And
That's
then
found in the book of Genesis, the story.
yes, and so as essentially, the son starts crying, and I think his foot hits something essentially happens, and then a spring of water comes, and that
Hmm.
spring is actually real. And actually that water is called Zamzam water, and then the fountain water comes, and then I think she says the word Zamzam as in stop, and then the water stops, and essentially she goes around from mountain to mountain multiple times. So essentially we redo quite a few of those acts. And during those acts, we are allowed to make any kind of prayer we would like. And then obviously there are recommended or quote unquote sunnah way of doing things, which is sunnah is essentially what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, used to do. Yeah, following his example.
So just to point out here that this is a story that all Jews would have learnt, or any religious Jew certainly would have learnt growing up. And it's the famous story of Abraham sending away his son Ishmael and at the behest of his wife, and his son basically dehydrating in the desert and calling out to God, right? And we can look it up inside if you like, but this is a story which everyone knows. So there are points in which our religions overlap, but that becomes, in your religion, in Islam, a massive event, and everyone does a pilgrimage to Mecca. Do you go once a year?
No, it's once in a lifetime.
Oh,
Uh,
it's once
so
in a lifetime. Okay.
yeah, it occurs once a year, and the obligation is on anybody who has the finances and means to go, because it's actually quite expensive and it's not very easy, to do. So it's once in a lifetime, is compulsory on somebody who can do it. And in terms of for women, I think there is a genuine difference of opinion. Some scholars, as in by scholars, I mean schools of thought, so not just any
Mhm.
scholar. I believe there's difference of interpretation. So some say you have to have a male with you, and I think others say that you do not need a male with you if you are in a group of women, because your obligation to do the Hajj supersedes the need to have a male with you.
So, all right, that's an interesting thought as well, but let's put that aside for a second. So, have you done Hajj yet?
Fortunately, I am one of the exceptionally fortunate people who have, yes, last year.
Okay, wow. And how about, so let's get to that as well, but now, so you've given us your definition of Islam, and it is encapsulating yourself to God. And submission, you said, is too small of a term for it. In other words, because it's actually much more than that. And therefore, you use this word of encapsulating yourself. In other words, God is all around you. And that's what I'm hearing.
Evisceration of the self to become one with the will of God, like completely. So one of the amazing stories I heard recently was about charity, right? So actually our idea of charity isn't just we give charity, we actually purify ourselves through charity. We're letting go of our desires and our wants. So when you give money away, you're getting rid of that. So I think the Prophet one time asked his followers, I think to raise money for charity or something, it was either a mosque, something along those lines. And he asked his followers to come the next day, or I think the same day. But basically, when they came, the second caliph, his name was Hazrat Umar, he came and with 50% of his wealth. And then he saw the person who ended up becoming the first caliph, he came with 100% of his wealth. So that was the kind of dedication they had, in the sense that the ideal Muslim is one who truly, sincerely places the principles of God above themselves in every way, shape, and form. So
Right.
that's the idea of submission.
There's this concept which is found in Judaism called bittul, and loosely translated as annihilation of self to God. Right. So I think I'm getting an idea that this is a similar kind of thing that you're talking about. It's giving up the self, the ego, annihilating the self, I being the ego, and totally turning oneself over to the will of God, so that the I almost doesn't exist. You can never
Yes.
completely destroy it because the ego is
Yeah.
always there in some form. But that's why I guess the idea of submission is there in a sense, but the greater term would be self-annihilation. And the spiritual person can get glimpses of that self-annihilation if they work on themselves enough, that they'll get moments of total self-annihilation where they can actually feel totally at one with the divine. Is that
With I don't know if one with the divine, but I think that's kind of like the Sufi idea is, yes, like as in we're not literally one with the divine, but one with the will of the divine. Yeah. And kind of
Mhm.
also then we have this deep concept of taqwa, right? Taqwa means God consciousness. So God consciousness would be when, for example, it's kind of like the idea that you're always kind of, so the first caliph, again, I will give his example. They said that he was so like when he became Muslim, he almost, his every action was as if God was right in front of him, I think, or he would think of God before he did any action, right? So that is the ideal kind of level for a Muslim, right? And I think that's kind of what Islam truly is about, is really, and it's really about those principles, right? Of being, I would say, so the attributes of God are what we're meant to emulate, and the attributes of the Prophet, right? So always, mercy, always wanting good for other people, kindness, smiling, caring, loving. And this is all at a personal level. And obviously, we can talk about on a state level. This is not the case. So I think this is where kind of there can
Yeah.
be a dichotomy. But on the personal level, on an
Yeah.
individual level, this is what is required of Muslims. Yes.
So, okay, we got your definition. Now orient us. Where were you with regard to other people with other definitions, other schools of thought, etc.?
So to be honest with you, when I was at school, I was never even taught about the notion of schools of thought. I wasn't really taught about the
School, you mean
spirituality.
as a kid,
School, but actually, yeah,
but you went to public school in England, right?
I went to school. So I actually went to school in Denmark and in
Okay.
Pakistan, and then London. So my maternal side has been based in England for decades, and my paternal side has been based in Denmark for decades. So I went to school in Denmark and in Pakistan. In Denmark, I was in a state school or public school, as in the one run by the government. And in Pakistan, I went to private school. So in Pakistan, I did actually take Islamiyat, which was Islam. And there, we were never taught, or we may have been taught, but we weren't properly taught about the idea of schools of thought. And I think one of the reasons was they didn't want to sow division between
Mm-hmm.
Sunnis and Shias, because Shias are about 20% of our population. So it does make a lot of sense to not kind of teach schools of thought, because we're children and it can kind of sow divisions. But I think I was never taught that. So I never kind of knew, right? So the way one thing that was really common when I was in school would be a Sunni would, or a Shia would say, I'm neither Sunni, nor am a Shia, I'm just Muslim, which is very interesting. But then when you actually went into asking what the Sunni or Shia believed, it would be different. So in essence, you would say I'm Muslim, but really your beliefs are aligning with
One or the other.
more, yeah, one or the other, right? So do you understand what I mean? So it became quite difficult. And then when you kind of learned more about the history of Islam, so actually the reason I ended up believing we needed a school of thought is because schools of thought, not one, but multiple is fine, is because of the evolution of Islam, right? So after the Prophet passed away, so there were things, they needed to come up with rulings while the Prophet wasn't there. So how do you do that? And then the idea was, okay, we will use different methodologies. So, for example, one of them, Imam Malik, who I follow, he, for example, prioritized actual practice. So he gave more weight to that. So there were other aspects as well. So, for example, others lay more emphasis on logic. Some will lay more emphasis on analogy. So there are different methodologies of reasoning that you can give more weight to. And based on what you give more weight to, you can come to a different conclusion on the same issue. So in Islam, a scholar, a genuine scholar, so not just a random guy, or I mean, I'm being quite diplomatic here. So, for example, a crazy hate preacher, like they can say something crazy, but I'm talking about like a genuine, serious scholar, right? Who's actually gone in depth. They can come up with different conclusions on the same matter, and it's valid for one to follow them, because even if it's not right, if the scholar's intention is genuine to actually provide a genuine opinion based on solid sort of methodology, it's okay, even if that turns out to, even if it's not technically the right quote unquote thing
So,
to do in Islam.
just double click on a few things that you said, which I find really interesting. First of all, you said a genuine scholar rather than some hate preacher, you mentioned, which is interesting because you have populists everywhere, and somehow there are people who just want to preach what they think that the people want to hear. And sometimes that is hate, unfortunately. Now, that's different than what you're talking about, right? Which is someone who's going to tell the people the hard truths of what it actually says based on real interpretation, hard work of analysis, based on the traditional framework of how to interpret these texts, correct?
Exactly, and we have a huge tradition for that. So, for
Yeah.
example, like I cannot just come and say, "Oh, well, my opinion is this or that." Okay, I can say that. That's fine,
Yeah.
but that does not mean I have followed any sort of rigorous methodology. It doesn't mean I have studied the hadiths. I've gone through their entire chains of narration. I've gone through whether the people in the chain are legitimate, they're not legitimate, in what capacity the Prophet Muhammad SAW said something, what the probability of that hadith being right or wrong is. So, I mean, and then on top of that, you have the analogy, or what kind of thought, or are you going to emphasize analogy? Are you going to emphasize logic? Are you going to emphasize the tradition of the people of Medina? So there are all these different aspects. So for me to say X, Y, or Z, yeah, well, that's incredibly easy. But have I actually done all of that work? And that's the thing with certain for example, extremist groups like ISIS. They, for example, they're not, as far as I know, I don't think they follow any sort of method to actually come to conclusions.
It's interesting that, some people call them fundamentalists, right? And fundamentalism really means that you take the words literally and you just accept them as they are, face value, etc. Now, it's really interesting because in my podcast, the episode last week, and anyone who's listening to this can go back and check it out. I discussed was certain interpretations from the Torah where it talks about divorce, for example, right? And if you actually read the Torah itself, you find that divorce is only allowed in a very narrow case. And that is if the woman cheats on the husband and she's found to have cheated and there are witnesses, and if there's no witnesses, but there's a lot of evidence, then he's allowed to divorce her. If there's witnesses and she was warned, then she gets stoned to death, according to the Torah. But if there aren't witnesses, but there's a lot of evidence, then there's other ways in which to deal with her. And one of them is, depending on the level, but one of them is divorce. But other than that, the woman can't get divorced. Now, the woman also can't divorce herself. It's all in the hands of the man. The man is allowed to divorce her. Anyway, we can go on and on about it. But the point is that if you look at the way actually it's interpreted, though, through tradition, it's not interpreted that way at all. It's interpreted that there's actually a lot of leeway for when the man can divorce the woman, lots of grounds. She doesn't have to have cheated, and she can herself demand a divorce. She has the right to demand a divorce as well. And there are ways in which you can force the man to give the divorce. So there's this, the interpretation is very different than what's actually written in the book itself, in the good book, in the Torah. The 5 books of Moses says something different if it's taken on face value than actually the way it's practiced. And no one today is going to come along and say, no, you have to practice it in that very fundamental way. Even the fundamentalists within Judaism, what you might call fundamentalists, aren't that level of fundamentalists. And if someone showed up today and wanted to do that, no one would accept it. So what I'm trying to think about is when you say, I'm trying to use an analogy from the Jewish tradition, right? So that my audience will be able to understand this, right? So I think what you're saying is, and tell me correct me if I'm wrong, that there are certain people who are fundamentalists. They ignore this whole tradition and they just go back and just read all kinds of stuff, which maybe should not be read into original texts. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, potentially, but I think the thing is, the traditional Sunni position, right,
Mm-hmm.
is that you would have to either become a mujtahid imam yourself, which is an imam who has reached a level that you can interpret completely on your own, or then you follow somebody, right? So in other words, and the problem here is, as far as I know, for example, ISIS, right? I think they don't actually, they do not do either. I think they have not reached the point where they can actually go and interpret, right? you actually need to be a very serious, genuine scholar. And then secondly, I don't think they actually follow any methodologies. And furthermore, in terms of literalism, I think the problem is that in Islam, we have hadiths, I think, which clearly show Islam is not literalist.
Mhm.
There's, for example, hadiths which I think stated about it said something like everything bows down to God, right? Like the trees, the animals. And then I think the companions or somebody asked the Prophet, I don't see the bird bowing down to God and I don't see the tree. I mean, it's not happening. And then I think he said something along the lines like, it's not like a literal thing. They're not literally down to God, but they're maybe he meant it kind of like following the rules of nature, following the rules that God has set out. There's another hadith about,
They've submitted themselves to God in a way in which they can't have a will of their own to do their own thing, right? That's
yeah. I mean, yeah, like so I don't know exactly what the saying was, but here
yeah.
this is an example where he's clearly not a literalist. Then there's another example where he
Mhm.
talked about the sun and like how something happened to the sun and it's clearly not happening, right? And then Muslims have actually explained that, well, actually this is not, it's not a literal like saying of the prophet, right? So we actually, this is a very well-known thing. Like, so these kinds of sayings, some of them are definitely not literal, and it's just so obvious that in the saying itself, you just look at it and you're like, it's definitely not literal, right? So I don't think it's literalist, and I don't think Islam has a tradition of but maybe now there are groups that are literalist, but I don't think that there is a tradition of literalism, right? If you actually go through it and you actually see the history, you see them developing an entire set of jurisprudence. For example, the methodology, if you know about jury trials, Imam
Mhm.
Malik, he's actually the one who came up with it. And when the Muslims, for example, conquered Sicily, uh, they, the English saw it and then they found out about jury trials and they thought, oh, well, this is great. And then they actually copied it and then they brought it to England. And it's still used today. And I think during these recent riots, there were some jury trials as well.
So, where do you sit in all of this? Where's your tradition? We still didn't get there. Like,
Okay.
orient
Okay.
us
Okay, yeah.
where you are.
So let's talk about the history, right? And let's
Yeah.
get to kind of which school of thought I follow.
Yeah.
So we've already mentioned after the prophet passed away, you had these scholars coming and etc., right? But actually, so what happened was you had ex many exceptional scholars right after the prophet died. The idea of ijtihad means the process of scholarly effort to interpret and derive rulings. That, I believe, came during, I think, the first or second caliph. So it came then, but it hadn't evolved into kind of uh, codified methodologies. Okay, so the ideas were there, it was being practiced, but it wasn't kind of codified. And then the prophets, I believe, grandsons, so grandson would be Hassan Hussein. And then I think we get to Muhammad al-Baqir. I think that was Muhammad al-Baqir. He was his fifth generation descendant of the Prophet. And then you had a sixth generation as well, right? So Jafar al-Sadiq. So these two, along with other scholars, major scholars, they developed schools of thought. And people would then follow those interpretations because the common man, right, did not have, did not know hundreds of thousands of sayings of the Prophet. They did not know all of the different circumstances that happened in and everything. And so I think generally people would, at the time, they would follow a scholar unless they were a scholar themselves. So we had these scholars who were now devising a methodology for interpretation. And then you had two major ones. This is in a very similar era. So we
So,
had,
what time period are we talking here?
so Jafar al-Sadiq was 332 to 65, 360, 765. And then you had Imam Malik. He was there from 711 AD till 795 AD, approximately, right? This is a long time back.
And where was he?
So
Yeah. And where was he active? Which part of the world?
yeah, so he was active in Medina, which is the second holiest city in Islam.
And that's what is
Um,
today Saudi Arabia.
yes, that's correct. Yes. So he was one of the major ones. Imam Abu Hanifa was one of the major ones. And then we had Imam Shafi and we had Imam Ibn Hanbal. So these four are generally considered the major Sunni schools of thought. And then actually we had many others as well. And we peaked, I think, in the year 1000 or 1100, something around that era, at over 100 different schools of thought. But the current major ones are these four that I've just mentioned. And I was born following the Hanafi school, which would be my parents. But I switched later on to Imam Malik, and we can get into that if you'd like to.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. So you're now in the school of thought of Imam Malik, and what would be the hallmarks of somebody who's, as part of that school of thought?
I think one of the major
And what
differentiators.
and what attracts you to it rather than, the one which you were born into? And the other question I would have is, what is the process of, would converting be the right terminology from one to the other?
Converting, switching, yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's correct. Yeah. So what attracted me, right? So I think I found, so I was living in South Asia, and South Asians, there are two major sub-schools of thought of the Hanafi school, right? So we have in actually both of them, I think, are from India, actually. So one of them is called Band, and the other one is called Barelvi. So within the Sunni schools, right? And in Pakistan, the other schools of thought, so Shafi, Maliki, Hanbali, are very uncommon within the Sunnis, right? I'm not talking about Shias at the moment. And so I found the Deoband and Barelvi interpretations very strict, right? So, for example, here they would not just ask you to pray 5 times a day, but they would also say, well, you also have to do this prayer and this prayer on top before, after the mandatory prayers. Other than that, I just found it to be much, much more restrictive, and it didn't feel very natural to me. And the Maliki school, while it can be very strict, so for example, with halal food, it actually has some of the strictest interpretations. With interest, it's completely like I think it's completely just, I haven't even read a single scholar who said you can take interest. So in certain things,
Even
it's actually,
from the
yeah, it's completely,
So where do you put your money?
oh, we don't take interest on the money. We have to invest it elsewhere or something along those lines. You
So
can invest.
you don't keep your money in the bank, which gives.
I do, but I don't take interest from the bank,
How can you
or
not
I
take
don't.
interest? Is there non-interest bank accounts specifically for?
Oh, what do you mean? Like, as in? No,
I've got money in the bank right now, and it's incurring interest.
no, I'm not incurring any interest. So I've got money in
In
the
England, they
bank.
don't give interest. Banks don't give interest, perhaps.
You can put your money into a savings account that will give you interest, yeah.
Okay,
But I don't do that.
but that's what I'm saying. You have a non-interest giving a bank account,
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
and you won't accept interest from the bank. You won't put it in a bank account with interest.
No, and neither
Bet
will
you
I
the
give interest.
I bet you the banks you are giving interest because they're making money on your money anyway. The banks are. But
Unfortunately,
anyway,
yes. Yeah.
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 Oh,
Yeah.
so
There. Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
it's interesting. It's interesting that the banks must love you.
Yeah, they must love us a lot, actually. Well, the Muslims who follow this a lot, I guess. So actually, yeah, so we have that, right? And then
Just
so
as a
so
matter of
it,
interest, just on tangent on the interest thing for a second here, because in the Torah it also says you can't accept interest. So the rabbis came up with a pretty nifty kind of device, which is that okay, you're not going to take interest, but you're going to go in business together. Then you're going to share in the profits of the business, and you actually sign on a contract. It's called a heteriska, which basically in this contract, you're basically saying we're in business together and we're sharing some of the profits, and these are going to be the profits that we're going to share. Is there some workaround like that for people to go into business with each other so that they can do profit sharing. So you can be an LP or a limited partner in a business. So if I invest with you, let's say I invest, $1,000, and you're going to do some business with that, I should be able to share some of the profit, although I'm not doing the work. Or is that also forbidden?
I think business partnerships are highly encouraged. So business is actually very encouraged, and they often say that the prophet was a merchant himself and his wife was a businesswoman. So business is highly encouraged. Doing business with other people is highly encouraged. So that's completely fine. There are other elements, for example, which aren't allowed, which is, for example, short selling. So short selling of physical stock, uh, short selling of other stocks as well. So I'm talking about actually on a stock exchange, for example. I don't think that's allowed either, for example. So there are certain very strict financial rules that we have in the Maliki school, but I still think overall I found it very natural. And for example,
Mm-hmm.
the way we pray is slightly different, but for example, we pray with our hands open, but I just find it very natural. I find the rulings to be more natural overall. And considering that this school of thought gave higher precedent to the actions of the people of Medina, which were the people who were living in where the Prophet eventually passed away, in that city, I think it is very close to what was actually happening or how Islam was practiced 1,300 years ago.
Okay. So you made that switch, and what did your parents think about it? And how does that work?
I mean, it's just literally, you don't need to do anything. You just
Yeah.
literally just learn what the basics are of the school of thought.
Do you need to go to
And
a
then,
different kind of mosque?
no, I go to other mosques all the time. The one near me is follows the Deobandi school. I go there, I pray the way I pray, except when I'm praying behind an imam. Then I follow the imam most of the time, unless it's in the huge Tarawih prayers. But in a general sense, I will follow the imam when I'm praying in another mosque, and then when I'm praying on my own, I just pray the way my school of thought prescribes me to.
Mhm.
So it's very simple, kind of you just learn what the traditions are, what how you're meant to do different things, and then you just follow that. And my parents were completely fine with it. I think they would have been more upset if I had, I mean, become an atheist or something along those lines. But because it's within the Sunni school and the Sunni tradition, it was some people like apples, some people like oranges. It was just kind of like that, you know.
And if you'd become
And
a
my,
Shia, they wouldn't have been happy.
I think that, yeah, I think that would have been a bigger kind of a deal for them, right? Because that's quite a drastic change. And so my father, for example, he's a Deobandi. My mom is a Barelvi. My brother, I think one of them is a Deobandi, and my youngest brother, I've managed to convince him to follow the same school of thought that I follow. So, I mean, it's completely like we're really open to kind of this kind of switch. Yeah, I think so.
And so when you look at the Muslim community in England, for example, how many are there who follow? And do you have like communities, and like, how does it work in terms of, like, for example, like I live in a certain community here in New Haven, and in this community, mostly there's a certain type of school people who adhere to a certain school of thought of Judaism. Now, there are others as well in this community, but mostly, people who adhere to this school of thought kind of hang out together. I'm wondering, because it seems to me like from an outsider, it seems like, it's all one thing, like obviously it's not, but how does it work within the communities itself?
So actually, I really want to get to this. So in the farewell sermon, which was, I believe, the final pilgrimage of the Prophet to Mecca, he said, it's called, I think, Khutbah al-Wada, something along those lines. He said, "O people, your Lord is one, and your Father is one. There's no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, nor of a non-Arab over an Arab, nor of a white person over a black person, nor of a black person over a white person, except by piety, by taqwa, right? Which is God consciousness, how we act. And interestingly, so actually, the idea of Islam really was to let go of our tribal instincts. So the Arabs were very tribal, right? They had so many different tribes. Um, and the Islam came and it emphasized the idea that, well, actually, we have these tribes, but what matters more than our tribe is our piety, right? Our taqwa, right? Regardless of whether we're white, whether we're black, whether we're Arab, we're non-Arab. And so now I want to relate this to your question about the community. So interestingly, I think in London, it's not, this happens less. But if you go to cities outside of London, actually, a lot of people will say this is quote unquote a Pakistani mosque or quote unquote a Turkish mosque or quote unquote a, I don't know, a Bengali mosque, right? So it's very interesting that you just mentioned like how does the community kind of deal with this? And the interesting part is that the imam at the mosque I go to, which is very near me in the East London mosque, he actually reprimanded the people who were going there in one of the Friday sermons, saying we should never differentiate between any mosque, whether Turks are running it, whether Pakistanis are running it, whether Bengalis are running it. He said a mosque is for any Muslim of any kind. So I think that is the ideal, but in practice within the United Kingdom, I think the communities go more to the communities they're, well, I don't want to say originate from because some of the people are born here, but kind of their ancestral background is from.
Yeah.
So different Pakistanis, so a Pakistani from uh, a Pakhtun background, a Pathan background will go to more of a mosque that's run by Pathans that follows the Deobandi school, and then there are others, right? So Punjabis will go to maybe one which is following another school. If they've been going to that one, the Turks will go to the one which is run by the Turks. But in London, though, I would say that here it's really mixed. There's a predominant Bengali community near East London Mosque, but if you actually see it, though, you will see Arabs, you will see people from Central Asia, you'll see loads of different people actually going to this mosque as well. Yeah,
And
very
so
interesting question.
and you pray 5 times a day. And do you actually go to the mosque 5 times a day, or often you're praying on your own
So we only have to go to the mosque once a week.
on
So
Friday?
yes, that's correct. Yeah. So once a week, Fridays. It's about like it happens around 1:45, 1:30, 2 p.m. And then when the clock goes back, I think it goes back by an hour. Yeah.
But are there some people who go multiple times a day, or you don't have
Yeah.
to? There are people who
You,
do go
you
five.
don't you
How many
you don't
times are
have
there
to.
prayers in the mosque?
So all the five prayers are prayed in the mosque. So even the morning prayer, I have actually gone to it sometimes, and I've seen people even during like we're talking about 3, 4, 5 a.m. You'll see people in the mosque. So it's quite impressive that there's such a big dedication for worship, and you will see people during the the sort of afternoon, evening, and the night prayers. You see them at every throughout each one. You will see them actually go to pray in the mosque as well, but you don't have to. It's completely optional.
Now, let's talk a little bit about your interpretation, or your school of thought interprets this idea of Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, and those distinctions and where that came from. And so a lot of people in the West, for example, think that you have migrants from Muslim countries, and what they really want to do is they would like to turn the Western countries into countries which are more in line with their way of thinking and their religion. Now, that's a thought that people have, and some people suspect that. What would you tell those people?
Yes, so I actually haven't gone through a lot of sort of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. I know of the concept. So I think the basic idea is may get this wrong, so you would maybe need to speak to a really qualified scholar to talk about this topic.
Hmm.
So Dar al-Islam refers to territories where Islamic law is established and where, Muslims can practice their religion freely. That would be an authority that governs according to Islamic principles. There would be safety and security for Muslims. There would be non-Muslim rights as well. So, okay, so we have that. And of course, there's the element, I know folks will ask about the jizya and then they will ask about the
Yeah.
zakat and everything. I can get into that. And then the Dar al-Harb so that's where is the
Literally
territory is not, is the,
translated as the land of the sword, correct?
I don't know, because I think it's the territories which are not governed by Islamic law and where Muslims may not have the right to practice freely. And I think in the Maliki school, I'm not sure, this may or may not be correct.
Right.
I think Dar al-Harb is not just if it's not governed by Islamic law. If Muslims are allowed to practice freely Islam, and there's the presence of peace treaties, and also I think the relationship of Muslims and non-Muslims is also considered. So I think there are these kinds of elements as well. And also when dealing with territories considered Dar al-Harb, I may be incorrect, but I think the Maliki school does not advocate for perpetual conflict. So it is allowed, for example, for self-defense, I think also protection of Muslim rights. Uh, but also there are rules of war in the Maliki school, I think in Hanafi and Hanbali school as well. So you can't just like, let us say, even if we take the maximalist position that Dar al-Harb is the land of perpetual warfare, uh, that even then, you cannot, for example, go around killing civilians. You don't have the right to just bomb a school or a random concert and random people, right? So it would strictly, what is allowed in Islam is military on military warfare. So even in that in that interpretation, if you were to take the interpretation that it has to be perpetual warfare, even there, I don't think anything can justify the killing of civilians. I think it's extremely hard to follow these traditional schools and provide any justification for that. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the other thing is, I don't think Dar al-Harb, so as far as I know, Muslim countries are allowed to have treaties with non-Muslim countries. So as far as I know, so current, and I don't think Muslims are allowed to break their treaties either, according to my understanding. So right now, a lot of Muslim countries do have treaties with the UN Charter and different treaties. So they cannot just throw those treaties to the side and then say, well, we're going to be imperialistic and go around having war with everybody else. I do think that there are certain people who say that a treaty cannot last more than 10 years, but I don't know if you can then say, well, can you then just renew the treaty? So in that way, you can say, well, you can constantly renew the UN charters, and then even in these kinds of interpretations, and then you can say, well, if you're renewing the UN charter every 10 years, well, that means that you can't go around invading every other country. So I think that's one thing. And then in terms of turning the West into an Islamic country, I don't think there's any kind of, like when I go to the mosque, I've never heard of any Muslim saying that. I find it a bit comical. I don't think, yeah, I mean, I find it kind of like a conspiracy theory, right? Like somebody saying Jews control the world. I find it kind of like that. But yeah, it's true there's Muslims coming to Western countries, but I don't think there's like any kind of like conspiracy. Do you get what I mean? So there's no
Yeah.
yeah, like nobody's like actually coming around, like coming to the mosque saying, hey, like, how do you like take over the UK or anything like so that's not happening. But yeah, is there Islamic or is there Muslim immigration to Europe? Yes, there is. So I think there's ways of tackling that. I mean, I think one would be to have fewer wars in the Middle East. And I think also there's a lot of bad governance in the Muslim world currently. So I think these two factors, both of them, are a recipe for disaster, right? Because you have loads of conflicts. And then on top of that, you have bad governance as well. So I think a lot of Pakistanis, for example, there's no war in Pakistan, and it's by and large safe. And they're like, so even when the rights of people who are seeking refugee status in European countries, for example, Denmark, according to somebody who I know who works with these kinds of refugee cases, she told me that you have to prove, for example, if you're in Pakistan, that you're not just unsafe where you are, but you're unsafe in the entire country before you can get refugee status in Denmark. And that's very difficult to prove in Pakistan, for example. So if, let's say, you're Christian in a village or Ahmadiyya in a village, it would be very difficult to prove that you would face extreme persecution in Lahore or Karachi or Islamabad.
But there is
Because,
some persecution if you're, what you said,
I
Christian,
mean, I
or
would
what was the other thing you mentioned?
Ahmadiyya. Yeah, I would
What's
say
Ahmadi? What's Ahmadi?
Ahmad-
What is it?
Ahmadiyya is, so that's a group that most Muslims, I believe, do not consider them Muslim, but they believe in a prophet. Some people say they believe in a prophet after the prophet, and I think others say that they believe in a main caliph after the Prophet Muhammad.
And you say there is some persecution of these people in Pakistan?
I wouldn't say there's state persecution. I would say that there's sometimes there can be fake allegations of blasphemy, for example, that has happened, which then leads to mob attacks. But I wouldn't say it's common. So it's not like this is like an everyday
There's kind
experience.
of a blood libel that can take place.
Yes, you could say that. And then also there's the element but you also see, for example, like in Islamabad, outside churches, for example, I've seen like rangers, like really heavily armed security, I think state security there. So I don't think like there's
You know,
like
it's interesting. It reminds me of
yeah.
I many years ago I had we started like a little organization called the Movement for a Tolerant World. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but many years ago and it started because I was somebody from Pakistan reached out to me, and this was 2005, 2006, around that time, before Facebook, and it was relatively early stages of the internet. And he helped me out with this or that on my website. I didn't really understand what he wanted. I was a writer. I was writing for a certain Jewish website at the time. And we got talking, and we decided to start this thing called Movement for a Tolerant World. And we ended up building a relationship. And eventually I decided, let me fly to Pakistan and meet with you there. And he said, you don't do that. It's like, why not? He said, because you won't be safe here. And he really said, do not fly here. And he lived in Lahore. And he said that it would be dangerous for you to come here. End of the story was that he was a relatively secular person at the time. Then he ended up becoming very religious. He ended up working with the Wahhabis, and he ended up becoming very religious and became totally anti-Semitic. And so he
Oh,
started off, pretty open-minded and talking about
unfortunate, yeah.
tolerance. And in the end, I had to, anyway, it was a great shame. But the point is, I remember him telling me that it would be dangerous for you to come here.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting because I think it's very mixed because remember meeting a Pakistani Hindu in Dubai, right? Dubai, as people would say. And he actually said to me that I think I've never felt any discrimination in Pakistan. And he was saying, well, actually, the people I feel who have it bad are the Ahmadiyya community.
Well, how
So,
many
and
Jews live
actually,
in Pakistan?
very few. I think a few hundred actually. They
Are
have a
there?
census. Yeah, yeah. And actually they used to have a Jewish synagogue in Pindi as well. It's not there anymore. Well, it is, I think. It's still there, but it's not actually used.
It was less than
There's-
200 people, it says, as of 2019. And the majority live in Islamabad and Karachi.
Yeah. So I think and also I think I did see a social experiment of a person who wore visibly, like he pretended to be Jewish. He wore like the full dress, everything. I think this was in Lahore. And a random person would just as a social experiment, come and actually beat up this person. And
Really?
actually, everybody would come to his defense. And even
Yeah.
I think the police came to his defense, actually. Yeah, it was a pretend, yeah. So actually, I think, yeah, I mean, I would definitely say there are definitely extremist groups, but I would say, for example, my father, he's hired Christians, and I don't even know until some of them tell me, like, I'm Christian. I'm like, okay, cool. Like,
What was that? Your
yeah.
father? What? Say you said again. Your
My
father.
so my father, for example, he's hired Christians, he has a business in Pakistan. And so one time recently, for example, I went this year and one of them was Christian and I never even asked her. And she just told me randomly, I'm Christian. I'm like, okay.
Huh?
I'm fine with that, like whatever, like because I don't really care what her faith is, but not
Yeah.
in a bad way, but like it's like
In other words, it's not
that's her faith.
relevant. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not relevant to me.
I
Yeah.
just bring that up because the story you told me of when you were a teenager, I don't know if you want to share it, where you ended up watching certain YouTube videos.
I think, but that was actually, I think they were, yeah. So when I was a teenager, actually, so this was not actually Pakistani people. It
Yeah,
was,
no,
I
no.
think, yeah, it was actually like Western people who were saying quite anti-Semitic things, deeply anti-Semitic things. And I actually went to my dad and I told him okay, I told him, I repeated those things, which were deeply anti-Semitic. And my father, thankfully, he actually said to me, well, actually, Jews were deeply discriminated against during in Europe at a point, and they weren't allowed to walk on pavements. I think they were even beaten up, right, in Nazi Germany if they walked on a
Well, they
pavement
were,
before they're
yeah,
murdered. I think they
yeah,
would beat them up, that they wouldn't allow them to walk on the pavements. I think they would make them wear something to show that they were Jewish as well,
yeah,
I think.
the yellow stars.
So yes, exactly. So my father, I think he was alluding to that, right? That they weren't allowed to walk on pavements. They were deeply discriminated against. And thankfully, that kind of opened my eyes, and I realized that a lot of the things on the internet, like you have to be very careful to believe what's on the internet, when it, especially when it brushes an entire community
Yeah.
about something. So if it so the entire, like, if you said to me, yeah, well, one Jewish guy did something, yeah, well, I can believe that. But if you see the entire Jewish community, like,
Yeah.
that's exactly what comes to my mind. It's like my friend Alistair, who I met at university, like that guy, Levi, you as well, like, like you're like,
Yeah.
well, it's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
When they paint all Jews with one brush, it's just crazy,
Yeah.
because it's like you, like, because I've met them and they're they're not controlling the world. Like, it's just not true.
Well,
And if they were, I would be like, help me out as well, and we can
it
do it
would,
together.
it's the most absurd claim
Yeah,
because clearly we're not, because, just go
it's
around the world and
comical.
you see it. Yeah.
It's
It's comical,
comical.
but people really believe
It's
in it.
no, and that's the bad part, right? That's the dangerous part.
Yeah.
But to me, it's completely ridiculous because, I mean, I've met not a lot of Jews because I think the Jewish community is quite small, but the ones I've met, I mean, they're just like the way I felt is they're just like me. And then
Hmm.
you're just like, well, they're just like me. So yeah, it's just
And
like a
especially,
Christian, it's just like a Hindu, it's just like anybody else. It's like, I don't know. I don't see it's just another faith, right? Like, yeah.
but it's really interesting because when you get into the reason why I wanted to talk of religion with you is because I think a lot of my listeners are going to hear within what you say a lot of familiar themes. And a lot of our theology is very similar.
Yeah.
And not only that, but even, some of our mysticism, and we
Yeah.
haven't got into that because I know you study and mysticism from an Islamic perspective, of course. A lot of it is also similar. Now there are differences. I think just to just point one out. When I said self annihilation and unification with God, you said with God's will, and I understand the distinction between the way Judaism will see that and the way Islam would see that, but it's splitting a hair.
Yeah.
Now, I know
I agree.
the reality is that some people say it's the hair that makes all the difference, but it really is when you look at it in big picture, it's really splitting a hair. So the people who want to use those things to divide us, what they're looking at is they're looking at the 10%, which we don't see eye to eye on. But there's 90%, which we're the same about. And at the end of the day, people want to divide. It's all about someone manipulating the masses to gain power for themselves. That's really what it's all about, always. And like you said, some of these governments are dysfunctional governments, and there's bad governance. I think that's the word you used. Bad governance, to me, I'm interpreting that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that these are people who are trying to manipulate the population in a certain way for their own benefits, for their own power, rather than, go ahead.
Then do what's better for the public, of course. I mean, the amount of corruption, it's staggering in some of the Muslim world. Like, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. Like, I wish it was different, but if it was different, there wouldn't be that much migration. I'm talking about legal migration out of Pakistan right now, for example, right? And the reason is because there's so much corruption. There's lack of opportunities, and you have such a huge number of graduates who aren't able to get jobs. You have all this talent there. And some of the most talented people, they're leaving the country at the moment, for example. So that's an example of corruption and mismanagement, bad governance, leading to a lot of migration. So I don't think, so we were talking about, I think that was alluding more towards, the migration to Europe, but also I think there's also migration to Dubai as well. So there's also now some Muslims who are moving from the UK to the UAE, for example, or sort of the Khaliji, like Gulf Arab states as well. So I think there's quite a lot of migration going on in terms of both to the West, but also out of the West. So I think it's a mixed bag, I would say.
Yeah. Right. So let's talk about mysticism for a second here. And then also I want to talk about the kind of personal inner introspective type of work which one does from a religious perspective. Now, listeners of my podcast will know that we're in the Jewish month of Elul, which is right before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And you guys fast many more times than we do, but Yom Kippur is a major fast day, as you might be aware of in Judaism. And it's a very serious month of introspection, which I know that in Islam you also have with Ramadan and then Eid, etc. These are all very great introspective times. So let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, let's talk about mysticism, for example, because how would you define mysticism and mystics? Do you know any mystics in your community?
I don't think any of them would describe themselves to that level, because you would have to be really at the top end, right? We're talking about the creme de la creme if you reach that kind of a level. But yeah, in terms of mysticism, I think actually, so let's actually go back to the history, right? So let's start off with, so actually Iran, right? So before Iran became Shia, it was actually at one point a Sunni majority. And a lot of the
which time frame was that?
Pre-1500, the year 1500, yeah. So, and during this time period, you had some like really amazing mystics who were either born in Iran or they were of Persian ethnicity or culture. So by that I mean they could have been born in Afghanistan or Uzbekistan, but they had the sort of Persian culture entrenched in them. So even if they weren't ethnically Persian, they were deeply Persian culturally. And so you have these really major figures. So this is, in terms of time period, this is like, I'm going off by maybe decades or centuries. But so you had, I think, Bustami, he was a really major Iranian mystic. You had Athar, you had Rumi, I think Shams Tabriz. So the Iranians had a really huge sort of culture of mysticism. And one of the really things that I love about it is really its emphasis on the emotion of love of God and humanity. And one of the things, we have this saying of the prophet Moses. So, I mean, it may or may not be there in Judaism, but in Islam, I think it says something like, I don't know it exactly, so I might get it a bit wrong, but it's about, so for example, Moses, he sees, I think, a poor person or a beggar or a farmer, something along those lines. And he's saying, God, if I meet you, I'll comb your hair, I'll do this for you, and I'll do that for you. And he's giving God physical human attributes, and Moses reprimands him. And then he gets revelation from God saying, why did you reprimand my servant when he was trying to worship me in his way, right? So the idea here, I think the important idea here is that we may not be 100% right about our way of worship, but the idea here is that the intent to kind of be closer to God, the intent of wanting closeness or oneness with God is larger than maybe being a bit wrong. And if we are wrong, we can learn from it, but we shouldn't be too harsh in our reprimand, right? Like you were saying, that the
Yeah.
hair, right? And exactly like
Yeah. Yeah.
here, like it's the hair here, right? Missing the main point, right? And we're looking at the hair and we're like, well, you're not doing exactly this. And
You
it's
know,
like, well, we're not doing exactly that. You're right, because we're humans. Humans, all the humans aren't going to have exactly the same idea.
yeah.
But if our intention is sincere and we're sincerely seeking closeness with God, I think that in and of itself is quite beautiful. And you were saying something about Judaism. I'm sorry for taking a long time. And actually, you were saying, it's so close. And actually, I think one thing that we actually miss is that Muslims, in our theology, we actually view the Jews to the Jews as the Muslims. They were the Muslims as the prophets, as there was revelation. So we actually view that as this same faith until Christianity comes, and then we view the Christians as the Muslims, and then after Islam, the Muslims as the Muslims. So we actually view it as
It's,
like one tree. We don't
well,
even
that's
see it as,
supersession, but it's a supersessionist theology, right?
yeah. So we don't even like, so when the
But
Quran talks
in other
about,
words, it's one replaced the other, though.
I'm not sure, but what I'm trying to say is, for example, when we read about the Jews in the Quran, actually,
Yeah.
or the Jews, this happened with the calf or something like that,
Yeah.
and Moses, we're not thinking, okay, this happened to the Jews. We're thinking this is happening to the Muslims, because that's the Muslims at the time, right? When they're in Egypt and they're being mistreated and they have to migrate, we're not viewing that as Jews are migrating, we're viewing that as actually Muslims are migrating. So actually the idea, the closeness is actually really like, because at certain points we don't even view it as different faiths. We actually view it as it's the same faith.
As a
Um,
continuum. But it's
yeah,
also, like I point out,
yeah,
that that's supersessionist from a Jewish perspective. So Jews will
yeah.
look at, because a lot of Christians will say, well, you don't need Judaism anymore because now you have Jesus and you have the New Testament. So therefore that superseded, it took the place of Judaism. And these stiff-necked people, the Jews, they wouldn't accept Jesus. And that has been sources of anti-Semitism for
Okay.
centuries. And then what happened with Islam did the same thing. And they basically said, okay, 1 second, you actually don't need Christianity and you don't need Judaism because we have Islam.
Is
And
that
so in other words, that evolution, which is seen, actually is something from a Jewish perspective. We see that as
okay?
an imposition, right?
Imposition. Okay.
Because
Mm.
one, we don't feel that we need to change anything. I know,
Oh yeah, I'm not saying you
yeah,
should. Yeah,
I know.
right.
I'm not
Okay.
saying, but I'm saying that is
Yeah.
the way it's viewed. And
Okay.
so I think there's like a major disconnect in many people's minds, because it's really interesting from a Jewish perspective, and I've pointed this out in on this podcast before, that from a Jewish perspective, you can actually feel that maybe my theology is, and I don't personally feel this way, but I'm saying from the perspective of Judaism, you can feel that your theology is superior to somebody else's theology, but that does not mean that person should take on that theology, and it doesn't mean that we should make them that thing. In other words, it's a very unique thing. It's interesting because I did this episode on Candace Owens. She quoted this rabbi, and she said that this rabbi was a Jewish supremacist, is what she said. And in some sense, she might be right. He did feel that Judaism and the Jewish theology was superior to others. But that didn't mean that he thought that other people should accept it, or therefore he should hate other people who don't accept that. And that's like a very key difference. A lot of people, when the supremacy says that I'm supreme and now you have to accept that because I'm better. And if you don't get that you're better and you don't accept it, then there's something wrong with you. And therefore you're another. Whereas Judaism doesn't see it that way at all, because we don't accept converts. I mean, we do if they really want to convert.
Yeah,
We're
I
not
know.
looking to
It's
have
very
anyone to
difficult.
convert. So because of that, we're like a little bit of live and let live in some sense, right? We're like, you know what? We can think we're better, but that doesn't mean we don't respect you and you do the way you want to do it. But we don't want you to think the way you think you're better, which is fine. You can think that too, but please don't try and co-opt us. So,
But I think it's a bit unfair to say it's just like, but I think you would find that in every faith, right? Because if you think about it, if you even forget faith, like American exceptionalism, right? Maybe people don't think about it as much now, but you did have, I think at least the original Americans did believe that their ideals or their ideology was superior to the non-American ideals. And then yeah, and so if you had, for example, and obviously Christians believe in Jesus and they believe he's God and they believe in the Trinity, and obviously they don't believe that Moses is the last prophet, right? So in a way, everybody is kind of, anybody who has faith is kind of saying
right.
that,
But
well, I believe in this and I'm not believing in
right.
that.
All
So
I'm saying
so I
is the
don't
difference is
yeah,
what
yeah,
you
so I know.
is
So,
true. And I
yeah.
completely agree
So
that a
so
lot
that
of
doesn't, yes. So it technically, aren't we all kind of, it depends on what he, like, I don't know what this rabbi was saying or
no,
what Candace Owen was saying. Yeah.
I understand and I fully accept that Americans, it's actually healthy to believe in your exceptionalism. The
Yeah,
only problem
sometimes
with it, the only
yeah.
problem with if you believe in your exceptionalism, like for example, like example which I always give is that, you know, I'm entitled to believe that my wife is the most amazing woman in the world, right? I do. I'm unabashed about it, and I think my kids are the greatest kids in the world. I just think they're the most amazing humans. They are, and that excludes every other person's kids to being as great as my kids. It's true in my mind. That's the way it is, and I hope that you feel the same way about your wife and your kids. You know, it's
Yeah.
like,
Yes,
and that's healthy to feel that way
yeah,
because
yeah,
that's how you make yourself and your family feel special. So that's
exactly. Yeah,
great. But then if I'm
yeah.
going to then force you to accept that, then I've got a problem.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. I agree with you, right? So exactly. So I think one would have to be very specific about what somebody has said or what the thing is. But yeah, but I think in general though, I think what the really important thing about faith is not about, I really don't think what matters to me is what Judaism says. What really matters to me is, am I living up to the Islamic ideals, right?
Yeah.
Instead of looking at what, like, be the best version that you possibly can be, right?
Yeah.
As honest, as kind, as caring. And imagine if Jews and Christians and Hindus and Buddhists and all of us did that, and we
Yeah.
were really the epitome of our own faiths, and imagine how amazing the world would be. We would be the best of people all around the world, and we would exemplify different ways of reaching higher spirituality and really contributing to the world. So I don't think there's any problem with believing that Judaism has a, is the right path, because that's literally what makes you Jewish, right? So yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, that's
exactly.
literally, like, yeah, otherwise you're not going to be Jewish. Like, you wouldn't be Jewish.
In some
Yeah.
sense, being Jewish is part of. Someone once asked, like, what does it really mean to be Jewish? And I think the best answer that I've ever had from anyone is that it means it's being part of a family, because it's more than just a religion. And you just need to ask the people who hate Jews, and I'll explain that to you very clearly. But the truth is that it really is because all Jews are related in some way to each other, because it's more than just a shared family of faith. It's not just a faith community. It's also because Jews only intermarry Jews, and that's always the way it's been. And we have very few converts because it's not encouraged to go out there and to proselytize people and get people. We don't try and convert people to our religion. So therefore, it really feels like being part of a family. So you could think And there are many Jews. Bernie Sanders, for example, in America, is a person who, although he's Jewish, it's not important to him to be Jewish. And he certainly doesn't believe in any of the tenets of Judaism, but he's still part of the family. Because you can renounce your family, but it doesn't help. Whereas with other religions, that you can actually stop being it because you stop believing in it. Whereas that doesn't really work with us, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I think what you're alluding to is where there's also the element of being ethnically Jewish, is that right? Or so you're always part of that kind of family of like the Jewish like community. Do you get what
Yeah,
I
it
mean?
is an ethnicity. It certainly is.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it
So
is
so
certainly an
so so
ethnicity.
and because of that, you're kind of like within a family. Yeah. So I think that
Yeah,
does make it a
that's right.
bit
Yeah, yeah.
different than
Thank you
other faiths, because other faiths don't kind of have that, right? Like with Islam, it's like you can be. I've met white Muslims as well. You
Yeah,
meet black Muslims as well.
I
You
heard
meet
Sam Harris was talking
brown
about it the
Muslims.
other day, and he was
Yeah.
saying, the famous atheist, Jewish atheist,
Mm.
by the way.
Yeah.
And although he's an atheist, he considers himself very strongly to be Jewish. But he said, he was on podcast, said, I could literally convert to Islam right here, right now on this podcast, and I'd be a Muslim. It's just
Yeah.
really simple to do. And then if I did that right now, you'd probably accept me as a Muslim.
Yeah. I mean, I do think I would, yeah. But I think actually to go to Mecca to do the Hajj, I think they actually ask for a certificate from the mosque, actually.
Oh, really?
Because, yeah, I didn't know that. I'm not sure, but I do think they ask for one. But I think you only need like two, three witnesses, and you just need to say two sentences, and that's about it. You know,
As they
two
say in
witnesses.
England, Bob's your uncle.
Well, like that's it. But literally, and so yeah. So I think you this kind of thing, like, so Islam is a very open tent. And then and even when you try to close the tent, right, you can get reprimanded, right? Like, why, like I said, the Imam was saying, why do you have a why are you even saying it's a Turkish mosque or a Pakistani mosque? It's
Yeah.
not one. It's a mosque for everybody. So we even get reprimanded for even trying to close the tent, because the tent is meant to be, you're Muslim, that's it, you're part of the tribe, that's it, end of story. You know,
Yeah.
so it's a huge, and then we also, did we ever talk about the concept of the ummah?
Oh, no, let's do that.
No. Yeah, so actually the concept of the ummah is, so we have three levels, I think. So we have the level of brotherhood, I think, of humanity. So that's like all human beings are your brothers and sisters. And then we have a brotherhood of Islam. That would be the all Muslims. So that's quote unquote the Ummah. So generally, when Muslims refer to the Ummah, they refer to that and not the even larger tent of humanity. And then we get to the family unit, right? I think that's also we think that's also called Ummah. I'm not sure. But so basically, so we have that kind of a concept, and it's really kind of like anyone, just literally. It's a really broad church, a tent, sorry, not
Yeah.
church, but tent. Literally not a church, mosque, a really large mosque. And it's just like, yeah, sure. Anybody, just, yeah, sure.
The barrier
But
to
it's
entry
quite,
is relatively low.
huh? Yeah,
The
it's
barrier
very
to
low,
entry is very low.
very low. Yeah.
So in Jewish mysticism, for example, you have a very elaborate structure of how God works in this world, for example,
Oh, interesting.
right?
Okay.
So you have Jewish mysticism. You'll see behind me, there's yellow volumes.
Yeah.
That's the Zohar, actually translated from Aramaic to English. So this is an English version of the Zohar. I have the Aramaic version right here, right there. That's the Aramaic version of the
Oh,
Zohar, which is the magnum opus of Jewish mysticism. And I actually have a whole series of my podcast about the Kabbalah. But there's such a thing called the Eitz Chaim, or the Tree of Life. I'm wondering, to your knowledge, in your version of Islam, do you have any structure? Like, it's interesting
yeah.
because, of course, the whole idea of anthropomorphizing God is something which is Judaism doesn't believe in, and neither does Islam. But how do you describe God then? What's the description, and how
Okay.
does God work in the world?
We have, okay, so we have a actual chapter, which is only 3, 4 lines, and I can just say it to you in English because I say it almost 5 times a day daily anyway. So there's only one God. God has no beginning, no end. He begets not, nor is begotten. and nothing can be compared to him. And him is just used for the sake of using he. We don't actually believe God is male. So
Yeah.
that is our 3-4 line definition of God. And then we have the attributes of God.
Right.
So we
That's
have, I
what we're
think,
talking about.
99 or 100 attributes of God. So there are things like, so we have things like the most beneficent, the most merciful. We have Al-Qudus. So Al-Qudus, for example, is the pure, but it's not just the pure, it's also the all purifying. So in other words, it, it it's not just completely pure, but it also purifies,
So
right?
how
So
do you
it's
separate the attributes of God from the God which, that one line which you said?
in what sense?
So is
Separate God
God
from.
not, God isn't defined by his attributes, or is he defined by his attributes?
You are now getting into a level of
Right.
theology I do not have the answer to. But
Right.
this is a genuine, like, these are kinds of questions now you're asking, which I think Muslim scholars, like very serious people, have actually debated.
Yeah.
Is God completely one with these attributes, or are they separate from him? Things like that. You're getting into like a really,
But
I
what's really
think,
interesting, so yeah, of course, so Judaism gets into this, and there's lots
yeah,
of discussion around it.
yeah,
And you've
yeah,
got the Maimonidean school of thought, then you've got the Kabbalistic school of thought, and within that, lots of different schools of thought.
yeah,
But what happens when you get into it? And I took a whole course on Christian theology a number of years ago. And what you realize is that when you start grappling with these ideas, all the religions are the same. So when you start talking about the Holy Trinity, for example, from the Christians, people think, well, that is idol worship, for example, because they're saying that God comes in the flesh, and there's God the Son, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit, and there's three, and how can he be one? It's not monotheistic, etc. But when you really get into Christian theology, you start understanding that actually they've thought this through in a way in which is very similar to ideas found about attributes and the way, holy mystics in our tradition might be described. And maybe, so when you start, what is the mystic? What is the prophet? When you say there's only one prophet, but let's talk about a mystic, for example. What are the mystics? And as they get close and unify themselves and have total self-abnegation or self-annihilation or encapsulation, whichever word you want to use, with God, what are they? Right? And is that similar to what they are, is to what the Christians talk about the Son of God? In other words, so it all becomes very interesting. And when you start studying it in all the details, you start realizing they're all using the same language. And it's very easy for the ignorant person to say, oh, that's, an idol worshiper. And that's when
that's
it's really not that clear.
that's very interesting. Actually, yeah, so we have these stations actually. So you talked a bit about kind of about this, right? So we have this idea of nafs, right? It's an Arabic word. And this actually, like, it can be translated as being. I think it's also translated as soul, but really, I would say it's like everything. It's like the mind, heart, body, soul, physical element, mental element, psychological element, everything. Okay. And I think so. We have different stations. So the lowest one they say, I think, is nafse amara, right? And then you have nafse lawama, and then you have nafse mutmaina. Okay. So, and then I think there are even higher stations, but let's just go through these three, for example. So at the bottom level, you would be completely animalistic, right? Like you would have no inhibitions. You would like no kind of moral values, lying, cheating, anger, like none of that. And then when you kind of better, you start working on yourself. And there's a concept we have in Islam, which is called the which kind of means purification of the self. And two, we have a tree of good manners and a tree of bad manners. And the idea is, so the tree of good manners is good character and truthfulness. And then the tree of bad manners, that's actually the hard one. So really letting go of, and this is another aspect, right? Like becoming one with God, letting go, right? Like we talked about purification through charity, purification through fasting. The entire religion is, if you're kind of in the Sufi band, it's just entirely about purifying yourself. And so what are some of the things that we should let go of? Anger, having malice, ill will towards other people, any jealousy, enmity, stinginess, greediness, cowardice. So we have all of these different kind of tree of bad manners that we're meant to work towards ending within ourselves. And through this process, we can attain higher stations. And so nafs mutmaina means, I think, the being of contentment, or and that would be in a station where, for example, you lose 1,000 pounds or 100,000 pounds, or like you lose your business or something happens and you don't skip a heartbeat. You're like, it's from God, it's fine. And you gain 1,000 pounds, your heart doesn't skip a beat, or 100,000. You're just like, whoa, from God, right?
Not
And
weight, by the way,
that
just for the American listeners, pounds as in money. Yeah. Or
money, yeah,
dollars.
yeah, no, yeah, yeah, money, yeah. So really, so the idea here is, and it's not just like that is kind of just reaching that station, and we have even higher stations as well. And the idea is this kind of purification and working on these things helps you reach higher stations. Yeah. As from my understanding.
Right. There's a lot of inner work which is demanded of you as a very religious person. And in a sense, if you are a bad person, I mean, it's just not going to work. You just can't, right? In other words, so which it's really important for people to understand that I think in every religion, look, I've seen people who in Judaism, and obviously people in other religions who claim to work on themselves, and they're just bad people. I always say that religion is a bit like money. For someone, a bad person, right? The more money they get just makes them worse. And for a good person, the more money they get makes them better. They do better things to the world. And in many ways, I've just observed that, having grown up and seen very religious people being just mean spirited, bad, and behave very poorly, I've observed that people can work on themselves, and it just doesn't turn out right. I've observed that. So, but if for a good person who uses these things in order to, I read, I remember, I forget the name of the author, very famous author, Buddhist, and he talks about, the kind of spiritual ego where, people, you become so holy, you become so pious, and then you use that as your piety and how great you are with your piety, that you've reached all these levels. And what the person themselves are so unself-aware, they don't realize that they've grown their ego so great, so massively from these higher levels that they've reached, and they just become worse people. So it seems to me like it's very difficult to kind of really short circuit that human element.
You're talking about kibr here. And this is kibr here, I think in Arabic means arrogance. So one of the stories I heard, it's a really good one. So it's actually of night prayer. So a father and son would, I think they would do the night prayer either at the mosque or at home. And they were doing that one day, and the son says to the father, well, look at us, look at how good we are. We're doing the night prayer and everybody else is asleep. And the father responds, it would have been better if you had been asleep as well. Do you understand? In other words, the act of even saying that is so
Yeah.
bad that your entire night prayer is not worth what you just said, right? The entire night prayer won't like do it for you, like make up for the sin or the kind of
That
arrogance that you had there.
haughtiness. Yeah, the
Yeah, yeah, the
haughtiness.
haughtiness, right? So really, and that's really what I really, and you're just, it's so many times you have to check yourself, right? You just
Yeah.
literally, and that part, right? The arrogance, it's really dangerous. It's
Yeah.
actually, and I love the fact that in especially in the Sufi tradition, it is like essential, like it's like core part. Humility is a core, it's such a core part. And I think it drives so many people away from religion when they become arrogant, because people look at that. They see
Yeah.
somebody, who's praying 5 times a day, who is fasting, who's giving to charity, all of that, going to the mosque, and then they don't speak nicely to you. They don't
Mhm.
value your opinion. They like all of those aspects. And for example, if a
It's
girl
jarring.
is wearing, or if a girl is wearing a hijab in one way or the other way, and then people are judging her, for example.
Yeah.
Now, I find that to be really bad, because she's on her journey.
Yeah.
She is thinking for herself, and you might drive her away from the way she's wearing it already, especially if, let's say, she's in a Western society. She's 90% of women don't wear it. And I'm not saying people who don't wear it women who don't wear it are bad or anything like that. All I'm saying is she's literally going against the grain. Okay. So she already has a hard time. And then instead of being kind towards her, the internet comments would rather be, or the Instagram comments would be like, why aren't you wearing it like this? So I just think we need to, as somebody who wants to be good towards faith, right? Any faith, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Buddhist, I think we need to kind of cut people a bit of slack, right? And when we do that, when we're too quick to judge, what happens is actually it's the other way around. People turn away from it. And
Yeah.
that's what I remember telling someone was, if somebody is whatever they're doing, let's say a Muslim person who knows he or she has to pray 5 times a day is not, or they're praying once a day. Okay. Instead of saying, why are you only praying once a day? We should say, okay, awesome, good stuff, keep it up. Right. And
Yeah.
if we go like, no, well, you're only doing it 1 time a day. Why are you doing it like this? You should do it like that. Then they're just going to be like, well, I'm already doing one. Like, what's your problem? Like, just leave me alone. Like, it completely goes against them. Right. And that's what I felt like Islam felt like to me when I was in my teens, because
Yeah.
when you start praying, instead of saying great, they would be like, well, you should also do this one, you should do that one, you should be doing this, and you're just like, well, like give me a break. I just
Too
want to
much.
breathe. It's too much. But then, interestingly, I actually, one of the reasons I switched was because this one was a bit more relaxed. It said, well, you don't have to do all these extra ones. But interestingly, I've actually started adding some extra ones myself, because I feel a spiritual connection. I
Mhm.
feel closer. So the entire thing, by not being as like, you have to do this or it has to be like that, or judgmental and all of that, the more spiritual and the kindness and these kinds of things,
Yeah.
they bring people closer rather than
Yeah. And
and that
you're
works
on
for
your
you
own
as
journey.
well.
And it's
And that works for you as well, right? Because you were
yeah.
saying the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you felt the same thing in Judaism as well.
Well,
And I think,
the
yeah,
autonomy is so important. I think what you're pointing out here is the autonomy, right? You made the decision to switch, and now you're on this journey, and now you are making the decisions based on the spirituality that you feel, that
yeah,
this now feels natural to you. Some people might argue that you're feeding your ego by doing that, but let's leave that to the side.
yeah,
It's interesting that there's a little story, a little bit similar to your story, where in the synagogue, the most important people in the synagogue stand at the front of the synagogue, and they're saying, oh, I'm a nothing, I'm a nobody, I'm a nothing, I'm a nobody, I'm totally nothing. So there was a new guy came to synagogue, and he saw this happening, so he also got up there and he started saying, I'm a nothing or a nobody. And everyone looks and looks, and they say, look, who thinks he's a nobody? Yeah.
yeah,
So in
yeah,
other words, like, like the idea is that the ego is so pernicious. And this is the problem, right? With us as humans, that anyone who's gone down this path of spiritual, some kind of spiritual journey of trying to deal with their ego. And by the way, every spiritual mystical path does the same thing. If you sincerely try and go down this path, what you will find is that the ego is pernicious. It keeps kicking in, and it keeps like it's like whack-a-mole. It's gonna show up here, and then you think you've dealt with it here, and it shows up there, and it shows up there, and and if you're not aware of this, you just become this spiritual egoist. and it can be really ugly. And so I always say that, that's something one needs to be aware of, but I don't know whether you can ever deal with that ego issue. People don't like religion. I'm like, this isn't a religion problem. This is a human problem. Like we are, if you didn't have religion, you would have something else. It wouldn't matter, right? It's like George Orwell.
Agree, yeah.
So I think what I'd love a lot of people to take from this conversation, and I really appreciate your time, is to realize that, there are, whichever tradition you go to, whichever kinds of people you are, really it's full of a lot of people just trying to better themselves, trying to connect, trying to make the world better for other people. And it's, despite what you listen to on the news, and there's a lot of negativity out there, and there's a lot of people trying to, portray all people as this or that, it's simply a false narrative. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree. And I think the problem is that, yeah, I completely agree. And I think we have to um, look at the historical evolutions as well, right? Like you mentioned initially about divorce, right? And it's the same with Islam as well. You have to look at the historical evolution as well, and the traditions that talk about not being literalist and all of these different things. And then when you actually see it like that, then you actually see something, well, actually, at least at a personal level, that is really strict about us being the absolute best human beings we can be to especially other human beings. And one thing I really want to say is that generally in Islam, we have two kinds of sins. So we have a sin towards God and we have a sin towards humanity. And of course, God can forgive both of them. But the general rule in Islam is that a sin towards God, God can and will forgive you. But a sin towards humanity, as in backbiting someone, lying to somebody, cheating somebody, that can only be forgiven by that person in a general sense. So really the
that
treatment
exists in
of
Judaism. That exact same concept exists in Judaism, by the way.
Exactly. So we really need to think about ourselves like that's really, so when I'm going to die, God's not going to be talking about Dara Islam or Dara Arab. He's going to be asking me, how did you act towards other people?
And if you did
How
something
were
wrong, did you beg forgiveness or did you not?
Yeah, exactly. Those are the questions I have to answer. All of the politics and stuff like that has nothing to do with me. My job, and I will have to stand before God and answer for my actions towards everybody. I can't, and even including non-Muslims, there's a specific hadith about this. Anybody who takes away the rights of a non-Muslim on the day of judgment, I will, I think, be the non-Muslims advocate. I think the Prophet said that, or I will advocate against the Muslims, something along those lines. So the rights of other human beings, and we forget that element. And then I'm talking about myself, I'm not talking about other human beings, but what I'm saying is I forget that. And then if we just, oh, well, I'm praying and I'm fasting and if it's not affecting how you treat other people, it's a long way to go. And it's very tough. If you check yourself, it's on another scale of difficulty.
Yep. Anyway, this has been wonderful and really appreciate your time. And thank you for being here. This has been Truth's Jewish Wisdom for today with my guest, Shoaib. Grateful for you to be here. And I know that the audience is really going to appreciate this. Thank you so much. And until next time.
Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure.